Good morning, everybody. My name's Scott Power. I'm the Director of the Centre for Applied Climate Sciences at USQ. And the centre has approximately 20 staff in southeast Queensland, Melbourne, and some in the United Kingdom. And we conduct research, extension, monitoring, evaluation, adoption to help people manage some of the risks they face from climate variability and climate change, and to help them seize any associated opportunities. And we also employ a network of additional staff across Northern Australia called Climate Mates, who act as champions in the use of meteorological and climate science in decision making. And we have an additional 15 PhD students scattered across Australia and Southeast Asia. And before I introduce this morning's speaker, I'd like to, on behalf of USQ, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather. And we'd also like to pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And it's my great pleasure this morning to welcome Neil Hughes. And Dr. Neil Hughes is a senior economist at ABARES, the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Sciences. And he's been there for 15 years as an economist. And he's also an adjunct associate professor at Deakin University. And his main specialty has been on researching agriculture and natural resource issues. And his key areas of expertise include the design of water markets, water policy outcomes in the Murray-Darling Basin, and the effect of drought and climate change on Australian farms. And I'll hand over to Neil shortly, but just note at the end of the seminar, or after the seminar, we're going to have a 10-15 minutes session for questions and answers. And if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A box. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to Louis and Kate to take the slides, and to Neil for the presentation. Thanks, Neil.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me along. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay.
Yep.
Very good. All right. So I'm going to talk about some research that ABARES has done looking at the effects of drought on farm outcomes, particularly farm financial outcomes and profits, and try to link that a little bit to the idea of risk management and insurance, and how these better measurement of drought risk can support those potentially new types of insurance products. All right, so I'll jump in. Next slide. So I'll just give you a bit of background on all of this. Analysis is based on ABARES farm survey data. So ABARES runs its own survey program. It's been doing this for a long time, going back more than 50 years. So this data you're looking at here, this is coming from our Broadacre Farm Survey. It covers the major cropping and livestock industries. And so we get about 1,600 farms each year in that survey, collect very detailed physical and financial information from each farm through an in-person interview. And the analysis that I'm talking about here uses data from the period 89 onwards. So there's 45,000 odd sample points. You can kind of see them on that map there. Different industries spread across the agricultural areas. Yep, we go forward a slide. So what we've done the last few years is take all of that data and develop a statistical simulation model of farm businesses. So we call that Farm Predict. Farm Predict is a micro simulation model that establishes statistical relationships between farm production and climate information, commodity prices, and other exogenous factors. So it has a structure that is fairly standard among econometric type production models, but it adopts some more modern data science, machine learning based estimation methods to build up these statistical links between what's happening on the farm and the climate variables. So we have a range of climate data that we link to each of those individual farm locations, rainfall, temperature, different measures of exposure to extremes, different measures of rainfall and temperature across the cropping season that are relevant to farm businesses. Commodity price data, and a lot of information on the characteristics of those farms, their location, size, etc. And then, given all of that information, the model can then give you predictions about the use of inputs and costs of those farms, the production and revenue of different outputs, and then it can aggregate all of that up into various financial measures of farm profit. All right, jump forward a slide. This is a little bit more of a technical description of the model. So the machine learning aspects of the statistical model involve an algorithm called XGBoost. It's a non-parametric decision tree based regression method for those that care about that kind of thing. But for the purposes of today, I guess we can look at this as somewhat of a black box. You take into account information on the characteristics of farms, information on the climate that they're exposed to, and you get predictions about the production and the profits of those farms. And so the model can take account of a lot of different kinds of complicated relationships in between rainfall, temperature, and farm production. Often these relationships are non-linear. Often they involve multiple climate variables. So we know crop yields, for example, are strongly related to growing season rainfall, but they also depend on temperature and temperature extremes. And different aspects of farm production are affected by different climate variables in different ways. So livestock production is also affected by rainfall, but it tends to be a bit slower. It's pasture growth and livestock production depend more on rainfall over extended periods of time, whereas crops are obviously very dependent on rainfall during the growing season. So model kind of encapsulates all of that complexity and then gives you that resulting link between the total set of climate conditions and the farm profit outcome. All right, I'll jump forward a slide. So just some background on some results that we've put out. So this isn't necessarily the main focus of today's talk, but we've been publishing these results the last few years. One of the key things we've noted is that the climate has changed against farmers. So the last 20 years has been particularly hot and dry relative to the long run history. That change is at least partly due to global warming. We've got declines in winter rainfall in southern Australia that are kind of explaining most of that effect, but you've also got higher temperatures as well. And that map just shows you the effect of all of those changes over the last 20 years on farm profits. So holding all else constant, farm profits are about 25% lower nationally due to the change in climate, and those areas in southeast, southwestern Australia have been affected more heavily. All right, jump forward. Now, we've also done climate projections. So you can take this model and instead of running historical data, you can run through the future projections. So those black lines are the historical results that we were just looking at the last 20 years, showing the declines in profit across different farming sectors. And then if you click forward, we can overlay some climate change projections. Yep, so just, click forward a slide. Yep, and one more. There we go. So, so these are assuming no adaptation. So it's just current farms with current technology, they're suddenly subjected to future climate conditions. And they give you an idea of the ranges of the potential outcomes if there was no adaptation. And so climate projections always give you very wide ranges because of the uncertainty, particularly over rainfall. You can see at least in some scenarios where there's potential for further declines in conditions relative even to what farmers have seen in the last 20 years. All right, jump forward again. Oh yeah, that's just those climate projections in the form of a map. So I guess since we're talking about Queensland to some extent, so the RCP 8.5, which is on the right there, is shows much bigger impacts in the livestock industry in Northern Australia, and that's because of the temperature effect. So the livestock sector doesn't get heavily affected by RCP 4.5 because it's less sensitive to the rainfall shock, but under the 8.5, the more extreme climate projection, we have very big increases in temperature which start to eat into the livestock areas. All right, jump forward a slide, thank you. So that was the bad news story. The good news story is that farmers are adapting, and that when you take out the negative effects of climate, productivity is going up. So that orange line is ABARES standard productivity measure, and you see it's very heavily affected by climate, the drought years. But it's also affected by the trend that we're now seeing in climate. So when you take all of that out using the model to simulate what productivity would be under average conditions, you can see that we've had pretty strong productivity growth. So farmers have been doing a lot, particularly in the cropping sector, all kinds of new technologies that mean they can grow crops with less rainfall. And so we haven't seen those improvements realised every year because rainfall has been quite low. But in the years where things have been good, like 2017, you can see the ability of farmers to produce some remarkably high yields with the new technologies. All right, jump forward a slide. So this was the main focus of today's talk. I wanted to talk about how we've been using the model to measure drought risk. And so the volatility in farm financial outcomes that is caused by climate variability and particularly drought events. So this idea of drought risk and drought resilience all kind of means different things to different people. So here we're defining risk as the change in farm outcome, for example, profit between what might be considered a normal year and a drought year. And that depends both on the exposure of the farm to climate variability and the sensitivity of that farm to a given climate shock. And so we've been using our model to start to estimate that drought risk, and it's estimated essentially as the percentage change in profits for a given farm between a normal or median climate year and a drought, in this case a 10th percentile climate year, holding all other factors constant. All right, jump forward. So this just gives you an idea. So we can take our model and we can simulate for any given farm a historical climate sequence, holding all other factors like commodity prices fixed, and then you get a sequence of farm financial outcomes. And then based on that sequence, you can start to generate the percentiles and the percentile metric estimates of drought and the drought risk. And you could, very similarly to how you would generate all of these types of statistics with actual rainfall data. It's just that in this case, it's not rainfall data or temperature data, it's the combined effect of all of the different rainfall and temperature variables on farm outcomes. Yeah, and so you can see the blue line there's the median, and the red, the 10th percentile, gives you an idea of how much change is associated with the impact of drought. All right. And that's a map of drought risk by region. So this report that I'm drawing these results from, we talk a lot about the drivers of drought risk and how that varies for different types of farms. So one big factor is drought risk, defined in this way in terms of financial impacts, is much larger on cropping farms. So the annual shock to farm incomes and profits in drought events is much stronger in the cropping sector than in the livestock sector, where livestock farms, their response to drought is a little bit different. They're able to basically buffer themselves a little bit by selling off livestock in drought years. So the financial hit is kind of smoothed out a little bit so that the volatility is not quite as extreme. So if you look at that map, you see the areas that show up as having the highest drought risk are areas that are focused largely on cropping, but are also have high exposure to climate variability. So generally, we're talking about the inland fringe of the cropping zone, where you've got lots of cropping and lots of rainfall volatility. Those farms tend to have the highest level of drought risk. So that you can see, for example, in Western Australia, that northern fringe of the cropping zone stands out. All right, jump forward. So one of the motivations for producing these indicators has been to measure change in drought risk over time. This is something that's been of interest to our department. So the Department of Agriculture have this very large program called the Future Drought Fund, spending lots of money trying to improve drought resilience and essentially reduce drought risks. So they wanted to be able to have some metrics to track over time to see whether their program is having a positive effect or not. So this chart shows the drought risk measure, so the percentage change in farm profits between normal and drought years across the broadacre sector, and it shows how that drought risk metric has changed since '89, and it's gone up. And that might be considered bad news. So it's important to understand why that's happening. That's because it's essentially been driven by a shift towards cropping. Particularly through the 90s, there was a very strong shift into cropping and out of livestock, particularly sheep farming. And so you can kind of see that in that chart. Yeah, the percentage of farmland devoted to cropping in the mixed and in the broadacre sector, you see how that's trended up pretty steadily, at least until very recently. So that was, I mean, that all came about after the sheep price collapsed in the early 90s, and farms kind of rushed into cropping, and that was, that increased their average profitability, but it also increased their risk. And unfortunately, that shift happened right at about the time when the climate was starting to move against them and become more volatile and drier. But you can see that it started to turn around a little bit in the last few years. We're starting to see farms, particularly in marginal areas, shifting back away from cropping and towards livestock, which kind of is consistent with the metrics we're generating, that we're seeing that the level of risk in those areas has really increased. Climate's become more volatile, and farms are kind of reacting and balancing their risk return trade-off. Jump forward a slide. I think there's a map there just showing you what that looks spatially. That's the last few years shift out of cropping in that kind of inland fringe of the cropping zone. You see particularly stands out in South Australia. Yep, all right, jump forward a slide. Okay. So that's drought risk. It gives you an idea of how sensitive farms are and whether farms are getting better or worse at managing their drought risk over time. Another very related question is, are farms in drought or not? So this has been a long-standing debate in Australian drought policy, kind of on and off for the last 50 years, about how you should measure drought, what should be the threshold for drought, what should be the appropriate way to define it, particularly with reference to drought policy and drought support. We have in Australia a history of using rainfall-based percentile measures of drought. So if we looked at the national exceptional circumstances schemes that used to apply, we had standard kind of rainfall percentile triggers for those programs, and those rainfall type measures based on annual rainfall relative to some historical reference period still exist at various state levels and even in some Commonwealth programs. But there has been a common view for a while, I think once the exceptional circumstances scheme got closed down, that measuring drought was in some ways a bad thing. That, we don't like lines on map, we don't like triggers. Therefore, having indicators of drought, whether farms are in drought or not, was almost unfashionable. So people weren't kind of looking into it for a while. So we've made the case at ABARES that it is useful to try to measure drought and try to measure it more accurately, because those indicators can be used in a lot of different ways. They can be used to support drought policy. They may be useful for farmers themselves, but also I think increasingly they can be useful for insurance. So if you have indicators of whether or not farmers are experiencing drought impacts, they potentially can be the basis of index-based insurance products that could be offered in private insurance markets as an alternative to government drought insurance. So being able to measure these impacts can be a useful thing. So the model that we've got is potentially one way to measure these effects, particularly the effects of climate specifically on farm profits. And I was going to talk about two related bits of work we've done. So one, looking at farmers' own perceptions of drought based on self-reported data, and then a new outcome-based drought indicator as an alternative to a rainfall-based percentile measure. All right, we jump forward a slide. Okay, so we have some, you can go back a slide actually, or back a click if possible. So I shouldn't have said anything. So this is some really cool data that ABARES has collected through the farm survey. So since 1993, we've had a question in our survey that says to the farmer, how would you assess the seasonal conditions in that year? Do you consider yourself to be in drought, below average, average, above average, or in flood? And so it's really interesting to see what farmers' perception of drought is based on that data, and to compare it to other objective measures of drought. So that orange data is the percentage of farms in our survey that said they were in drought in a given year. So you can see the spikes in 2003 and 2007, and in the recent years as well. The other thing we can do with that data is we've included it in our model. So we have the ability to run simulations on those farmer self-reported drought indicators in the same way that we're able to do that for farm profits and farm production. So we can simulate, for example, how farmers in the past would have assessed current conditions and how current farmers would have assessed conditions in the past. So we add on those extra lines. We just click forward twice. Great, thank you. So that blue line is how current farmers would assess that sequence of climate, and the black line is how 1993 farmers would assess the same climate conditions. And you can see, for example, in 2007, current day farmers, around 50% of Australian farmers would say that 2007 was a drought for them. but it would be over 60% if 1993 farmers experienced the same conditions. So there's been this change in farmers' perception of drought over time. So as climate has deteriorated and rainfall has gotten lower on average, farmers have changed their threshold for what they consider to be a drought. So we jump forward a slide. Oh yes, so that's just that trend over time. So that's, yeah, the percentage of farmers that would assess themselves to be in drought on average across that entire sequence, and how that's declined, particularly in the cropping industry over that sequence. And then if we jump forward one more slide, this is a map. So the map on the left gives you an idea of how farmers' perception of drought has changed across Australia. And on the right, you have the map we saw earlier about showing the effects of the recent climate trend on farm profits. So you can see those two things line up to some extent. So those areas in southeastern and southwestern Australia that have been heavily impacted by the decline in conditions in recent years, also showing as being areas where there's been strong revision in farmers' assessment of what a drought is. Interestingly, you see some different patterns in Queensland. And I'd be curious if anyone has any theories on that, but you can see that along the coastal part of Queensland, we're seeing also a strong trend with farmers changing their perception of what a drought is, but not further inland. And there are parts of Queensland where they're actually gone in the opposite direction. They're more likely to consider themselves drought affected. You may be interested to know that in that paper, there's also some regional differences that we note. So, for example, farmers in Western Australia, all else constant, are much less likely to consider themselves drought affected for a given level of rainfall that they experience, compared with farmers in New South Wales and Queensland. So some of this is likely reflecting the cultural differences in these states, which are tied to the different ways the state governments handle drought and respond to drought policy. But livestock farmers in particular in New South Wales and Queensland still very quick to consider themselves drought affected compared with farmers in other parts of the country. All right, one more slide. Okay, so this is the farm outcome-based drought indicator. So on the left, this is an example for 2018-19 drought. And on the left is a very conventional rainfall-based percentile drought indicator. So that's an annual 12-month rainfall number at each location. You compare that to a sequence. In this case, we're comparing to the last 30 years as a reference period. And you calculate a percentile cutoff, say the 10th percentile, and that's your measure of whether that region is in drought or not. But rainfall itself may not be a great predictor of what's actually happening to farm businesses. So rainfall over a 12-month period will not necessarily correlate with crop yields, given that the 12-month sequence at every given time may overlap multiple crop periods, include parts of the year where crops aren't being grown. And it also doesn't take into account temperature and other kinds of factors. So on the right, you have the model-based metric, and the model is trying to take into account the effects not just of rainfall, but temperature and the timing of rainfall. And so it's an outcome-based metric. It's showing you the change in farm profits relative to a historical reference period, as opposed to the change in rainfall itself. So if we, thanks. So you can see some of the differences. So they're obviously similar. 18-19 was a bad year. It was a drought in most of New South Wales in particular, but you can see some key differences. If you look at New South Wales, the rainfall numbers show parts of Western New South Wales as being not in drought. based purely on the 12-month percentile. And some of those areas come up as being very much in drought under the outcome-based measure. When you look at the outcome-based measure, it's drawing on the fact that temperatures were exceptionally high, and also that the conditions entering that financial year were poor already, and you take all of that into account, you have a bigger impact on farms in those regions. If you look at Western Australia, you'll see some very different results. So based purely on rainfall, you can see parts of Western Australia are below average and even classified as in drought. If you look at terms of farm outcomes, you're actually seeing above average farm outcomes in Western Australia. So what happened in 2018-19 was that conditions were mediocre in Western Australia, but not horrible. Crops were still harvested and produced. And prices were through the roof because the rest of Australia was in severe drought. So there was a shortage of grain, there was a shortage of hay, and farmers in West Australia were exploiting those prices. So that's another factor that we've built into our model, where we're looking at the effect of drought on commodity prices, particularly their tendency to spike up the prices of grain and hay. So that can dramatically change the outcomes for farms in those years. So for cropping farms that are able to get a crop in, potentially those high prices really limit the extent to which they're affected by drought. And obviously for livestock farmers that are having to pay to get all that grain in to feed their livestock, that makes things even worse. All right, jump forward a slide. So here's a comparison of that farmer assessment data. So that's the grey bars. And these are a range of different drought indicators, so rainfall, soil moisture percentile measures, and the profit outcome-based measure that I was talking about before. And you see how the outcome-based measure tends to line up more closely with the farmer's own assessments of drought. And there are certain years, if we look at, say, 97, 98, and 94, 95, where the rainfall-based measure is either over or underestimating the amount of drought relative to the outcome-based measure. And we jump forward one more slide. And here's some correlations. So we correlate the farm outcome-based measure with actual farm financial outcomes. So farm rates of return and the percentage of farms with negative profits in a year. And see that the profit measure is showing higher correlation with actual farm outcomes, even relative to the farmer self-assessment. As to say, it would appear that it is a better indicator of whether farms are in drought than perhaps farmers' own subjective experience of whether they're in drought or not. So there's different ways to interpret that. One, farmers' response of whether they're in drought could be biased by things like, we heard, cultural differences and other factors. But also this profit-based indicator is focused on one specific aspect of drought, which is what it does financially to the farm business. And farmers may be affected by drought in other ways and may consider themselves to be drought affected, even if profits haven't declined in any significant way. Yeah, so I guess the basic point of that was you can, using these methods, you can find some correlations with farm outcomes that are a bit better than you can with raw rainfall data. Don't want to kind of oversell the performance of the model. If you read through our technical papers, you can see the level of accuracy that it achieves. It's still a difficult thing to predict farm outcomes at a financial scale, and there's certainly a level of error and therefore basis risk left in these indicators. But there is potential to improve upon the crude kind of simple rainfall metrics that are still commonly used. So that that's pretty much it. So there's a bunch of links to ABARES reports. If you're interested in more technical detail, otherwise I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thanks very much, Neil. Terrific talk, some fantastic research there, very insightful.